Very often, when new American acquaintances discover that I am a professor of French studies, they say to me, "The French are racist, aren't they?" This always surprises me. How can we measure racism? How can we describe an entire country with a single adjective? And it's curious because the French think Americans are racist. The truth, of course, is that racism exists in both countries, but it's called different things, it manifests itself differently, and it has different historical roots. French and American approaches to others in their midst are grounded in their different histories. Most impactful have been the history of slavery in the United States and the history of colonialism for France. When I ask such Americans why they think the French are racist, they usually use one of two examples: French anti-Semitism and French anti-Muslim sentiment. Both of these examples, let us note, are not about race, but about religion. Anti-Semitism is a form of xenophobia toward a group of people based on their religion, in this case, Judaism. We will address these questions of religious intolerance in the next chapter, 7. In this chapter, we will focus on race, xenophobia, and immigration. More than just America through French eyes, this lecture will explore the mutual accusations of racism by these two countries and explain their differences. Most French people and foreigners know about racism in American history. The United States is known everywhere in the world for its long history of institutionalized racism and contemporary racial tensions. Almost every French observer who has come to America has had something to say about racism in the United States. Tocqueville wrote a 100-page chapter on slavery and democracy in America, which I recommend. I'll just cite Simone de Beauvoir in 1947, when she first saw American racial discrimination firsthand. Next to the spacious restaurant reserved for whites, the minuscule lunchroom for colored people can accommodate only 4 customers at a time. This is the first time we're seeing with our own eyes the segregation that we've heard so much about. And although we've been warned, something fell on our shoulders that would not lift all through the South. It was our own skin that became heavy and stifling, its color making us burn. Fast forward to 2008. The French, like the rest of the world, were blown away by the American election of its first black president, Barack Obama. Many French intellectuals lauded this historic occasion in the mainstream press. It was not just an American event at all. The world stood in awe and admiration of an America that seemed to manifest its highest ideals of equality and tolerance. Many French thinkers also wondered why France had not yet elected someone of color to the highest political office. There was a lot of soul-searching in France after witnessing this momentous turn of events in the American mirror. To understand French views of race in America, let's look at xenophobia in France. In France, the term race is hardly used. The term most commonly used is xenophobia, an umbrella word that covers all exclusionary sentiments, fear, hatred, or discrimination toward others based on many possible factors such as skin color, nationality, or religion. Slavery never existed on metropolitan French territory, although it thrived in French colonies and France participated in the slave trade. Instead, the histories of French colonialism and immigration have determined French attitudes toward others in critical ways. The French colonial empire was the second largest in the world after Britain at the turn of the 20th century, with a concentration of territories in North and West Africa, as well as outposts in Asia and the Americas. French colonialism was marked by the standard relationship of domination of colonizer over colonized, which affected the way French perceived of and treated its subjects. During and after colonization, which ended in the 1960s, many nationals from former colonies came to France. Indeed, France actively recruited foreign laborers to fuel its industrialization and modernization in the 20th century. Sub-Saharan and North African immigrants who had come to France looking for a better life than they could make in their war-torn, post-colonial, economically struggling home countries were most often relegated to subaltern jobs in France, excluded from mainstream society, abused and discriminated. We can't forget, too, that French xenophobia had also been directed at earlier waves of immigrants from other European countries, such as Belgium and Portugal. French xenophobia, like in the United States during its periods of European immigration, was not only aimed at blacks, Arabs, or Muslims, but historically at white Europeans who very often shared their Catholic faith. About 1/3 of blacks in France originate from the French territories of Guadeloupe and Martinique. While they may experience discrimination because of their skin color, they are French citizens with complete political rights and are therefore not considered immigrants. Hence, race and immigration are intertwined in complex ways in France, ways that differ from the American situation. Immigration is an important part of both French and American history. France has attracted immigrants since the late 19th century for its growing economy compared to other European countries. Because French population growth was stagnant, France invited and welcomed immigrants to build itself and its economy. In fact, France accepted more refugees in the 1930s crisis than the United States proportionately, and never instituted ethnic quotas like the US did. A supposed openness to immigration is part of the American national identity. In our first introductory chapter, we talked about the American myth of the melting pot. In fact, the US is better described as a salad bowl, and France is the real melting pot. To understand this, let's look at the concept of multiculturalism that is embraced by many Americans. Multiculturalism is the manner in which American society handles its cultural, ethnic, or racial diversity. It's a way to manage differences by emphasizing distinct identities and valuing and respecting differences. One can be Chinese American or Mexican American and still be successfully integrated into American life while retaining features from her or his place of origin. In a salad bowl, tomatoes, lettuce, and onions retain their distinct integrity, but together, thanks to the vinaigrette of life experience, form a cohesive, flavorful whole. French society, on the other hand, generally resembles a melting pot, since French culture espouses an attitude of universalism as opposed to the American multiculturalist ideal. Universalism puts more emphasis on adaptation to universal French values. Newcomers should try to assimilate to French norms of language, dress, habits, and values by schooling their children in French schools, mingling with native French people, etc. The ideal behind universalism is equality. Its goal is to integrate newcomers, not to maintain hybrid identities such as Vietnamese French or Moroccan French. Because of a long history that goes back to the French Revolution, accentuating differences among citizens is considered dangerous for the Republic. Instead, universalism stresses common French values. Now, of course, universalism in France is not a formal policy or a set of rules, and it is not appreciated by everyone in France either. But it's an interesting theoretical model for us to compare with American multiculturalism, which is also just a model of understanding relations among different peoples. And it is also not unanimously agreed upon by all Americans. To be multicultural does not equal being tolerant. To be universalist does not equal being intolerant. Both models share the same goal of integration. In both France and the United States, the question is how to integrate newcomers. It is not whether to. French and American societies are both still struggling with a big question. What degree of cohesion and pluralism is desirable for a nation? What is it to be French or American? These identities are never fixed, and they are constantly evolving. The French are very interested in policies of affirmative action in America. Their interest is wary, however, for affirmative action is in clear conflict with the principle of universalism. Why? Because affirmative action explicitly highlights differences of skin color, gender, national origin, and it implicitly acknowledges that inequality exists. Nonetheless, in recent years, several prestigious French schools like the Institute of Political Science in Paris are experimenting with affirmative action. The change came about after educational leaders realized that top schools were continuing to admit students only from predominantly upper socioeconomic and white backgrounds. In other words, they realized that elites were reproducing themselves and that meritocracy was just an illusion, as it is in the United States. The current French experiments with affirmative action, called positive discrimination in French, are all targeted purposefully to students of low socioeconomic status and not based on criteria of skin color, gender, or national origin, even though we all know that these three factors are correlative with socioeconomic status. In fact, this socioeconomic approach to affirmative action in France was proposed by a French scholar named Patrick Weil, who came to study affirmative action in the US, particularly in Texas. Weil was impressed with the 10% law that since 1997 guaranteed the top 10% of graduates from each Texas high school automatic admission to a Texas state university. This law got around race de jure to valorize geographic diversity. But we know that de facto in Texas, as in France, race and socioeconomic status are correlative with neighborhoods and cities. What I find very interesting as a professor of French studies is that in the United States, in the last year or so, universities are trying to increase the socioeconomic diversity of their student bodies, most likely in the wake of court rulings that are rolling back affirmative action. But maybe some of this new focus in the United States is inspired by the French example. I haven't said my last word on this topic, but I'm starting to wonder if there is mutual Franco-American influence taking place around affirmative action. To conclude, both French and American societies believe in themselves as meritocracies, where anyone, regardless of race, gender, national origin, or class, can rise to the top of society purely because of their skills and abilities. Is this an illusion? Yes, indeed, for both countries. Despite their very different histories and approaches to integrating others, France and the United States face the same challenges in promoting cohesive, tolerant, and open societies for all their peoples.